Hi, Grant from the Bird Emergency here. I had a bit of a health scare, and it meant I stopped uploading after one episode. Now, I'm back, and we're back, and I'm continuing interviewing and editing and getting ready to present. So there's a couple of episodes in the can which are old, from before I had something big cut out of me. First up is a really great discussion I had with Amanda Lilleyman, who is a researcher at Charles Darwin University in Darwin. And following that, there'll be some more about curlews with author Harry Sadler. And then we'll explore one of the ways that seabirds are being saved around the world with Ben Sullivan. And then we'll get on to all of the new episodes. So if you haven't taken the opportunity to listen to the first episode with Steph Burrell, episode 1, Steph Burrell, that's a really great chat about seabirds. And now, episode 2. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Amanda Lilleyman, a research associate at Charles Darwin University in Darwin, in the far top end of Australia. You're the lead on this project, aren't you, at the Curlew project?
So I work on the Curlew project, which is strategic planning for the Far Eastern Curlew, but I work with several other researchers on the project.
And the project's funded by the Threatened Species Recovery Hub and Darwin Harbour, is that right?
Yeah, so it's the National Environment Science Program Threatened Species Recovery Hub that funds the project. And then we also have some operational funding from Darwin Port.
And how long is the project scheduled to go for?
We started the project in 2017 and it will finish up in mid-2020.
Before we get more into the project and about the curlew generally, are you Darwin born and bred, or did you find your way to Darwin from somewhere else in Australia?
I found my way to Darwin. I pretty much followed the birds. So I'm originally from the Central Coast in New South Wales. I studied at Newcastle University, and then I decided to come to Darwin for my honours project, which was on shorebirds, and then I stayed on for PhD and more shorebird opportunities through the Curlew project.
So you're a long-time shorebird nut.
Yeah, more or less. I think it's getting on to about 7 or 8 years now that I've been specifically researching shorebirds.
We'll get back to your interest in shorebirds generally in just a little while, but can you talk us through the genesis of the Curlew project? Yeah, how it started and what its broad aims are.
Yep. So the Curlew project started because the Far Eastern Curlew is listed as a critically endangered shorebird under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. The reason why we're focusing on it in Darwin Harbour is because some recent monitoring of shorebirds in the harbour, specifically at Darwin Port, has shown that the Far Eastern Curlew has increased in numbers over the years. So we've got data from about 9 years of these monitoring surveys. And the Far Eastern Curlew had increased over that time, as well as some other species of shorebird, and some had decreased and some were stable. But we were particularly interested in Far Eastern Curlew because it is critically endangered. So we wanted to know, one thing that we'd like to know is how are the birds doing in Darwin and why are they increasing here? Because in other places around Australia, they're decreasing, which is the general trend for the species globally because they are so highly threatened. And so what happened was Stephen Garnett, who came up with the project idea working with Darwin Port and Richard Fuller from the University of Queensland, they put in a project proposal to the National Environment Science Program. And they essentially wanted to know how we can learn about these birds and other shorebirds so that we can protect them in a developing harbour context. So it's really about understanding the specifics of the ecology of these shorebirds and how we can manage them when places like Darwin Port might want to expand their small industrial development in that area, but also because the Darwin coastline is a developing area. The population may grow into the future, the economy may grow, and there will always be a need to transport in and out of Northern Australia, and Darwin Harbour is a really central hub for that. So it's really about having the foresight to manage the birds instead of doing things like environmental impact assessments at a later stage. So it's really a whole of harbour approach.
What are the other hotspots for the Eastern Curlew in Australia?
There's actually a lot of hotspots around Australia. Probably some of the best sites in Australia are northwestern Australia in Roebuck Bay and down towards 80 Mile Beach. That is by far the best shorebird spot in Australia. And there's some really great research going on out there. There's some wonderful counts happening. And if you just like looking at shorebirds, it's so nice to go there and see the birds up close. And then there's also parts of Queensland, so southeast Queensland, around Moreton Bay, and then further north, there's good populations of Far Eastern Curlew. And also around the Gulf of Carpentaria is another really good shorebird hotspot.
The areas in the northwest, say near Roebuck, are their populations of the curlew dropping? Is that the gist of what you were saying earlier on?
I'm not sure of the specifics. There is a good research paper about where exactly the populations are increasing and decreasing. I'd have to check those papers, so maybe don't quote me on that.
No.
But generally, for the species, the species is declining, and they have declined over several years. But there are some sites which we are seeing these local scale increases. So it's really just about understanding the local scale effects. So what's happening and why, and how can we, if we are doing something really well, like managing the habitat really well, then that's really great, and we'd like to mimic that elsewhere on the non-breeding grounds. So yeah, it's really just about managing them and managing the habitat.
Are the birds that are in other areas, and I'm thinking specifically of Moreton Bay, where the Toondah Harbour project, if it goes ahead, will have a significant impact on that population. Are they able to redirect themselves in, say, the subsequent migrations after that development goes ahead to find their way to Darwin, or are we just likely to lose them?
We probably wouldn't see that much of a change or that much of a shift, but that kind of thing is pretty well unknown. So there's a couple of hypotheses about the distributional shift over a larger scale, but that's more to do with younger birds where they're not so faithful to particular sites. But somewhere like Moreton Bay, where you would have birds coming back year after year, it really is so important for those birds to have that site available to them, because they are so site faithful. These shorebirds will turn up to the same site year after year. So, and we know that from flagging studies and also tracking. And one other thing that makes me say that it's too far for these birds to essentially shift from somewhere like Moreton Bay over to Darwin is some of the recent tracking studies we've done. So last year, I was lucky enough to get a couple of GPS trackers on two Eastern Curlew in Darwin.
And I saw they've got really good names, 00 and 01.
Yeah, they're not creative at all. So I think I called that 0000, and then the other one is 01, but it also looks like OI, which is like oi. So I was calling it oi, and that's as creative as I was.
Now, for people who are interested in that part of the project, because we'll jump back a little bit. Part of what you're doing with the project now is misnetting and tagging with GPS when you can get those units available. Hopefully there'll be a great benefactor somewhere, and we'll give you a bundle. That's on the, what's it called, the Far Eastern, the East Australasia flyway, isn't it? What's the
Yeah,
website called to track them?
well, we have our website that we log into to look at the data where we can track them in essentially real time, and it's just based on the subscription that we have. So we bought the tags from a company, and then you also get a subscription. So we essentially just log in to check in where the birds are, and it's really great to see because I know right now that both of the birds are in the Yellow Sea region, and I checked that this morning.
And they're on their way here now.
Well, yeah, they are. So the one bird bred in the far northern hemisphere in Siberia on the Kamchatka Peninsula. And it was just a few weeks ago that the bird left the Kamchatka Peninsula and it flew down to, I think it's South Korea it's currently at now. And it's feeding in this mudflat area near Airport Island. The other bird is in Bohai Bay, which is kind of western Yellow Sea region. So they're both in the Yellow Sea region, and I'm just waiting for them to come back to Darwin, and fingers crossed that they do come back. So just getting back to the Queensland and Darwin comparison, what we found from our tracking was that the Darwin bird bred in quite far north, latitudinally, in the Kamchatka Peninsula, and Queensland birds didn't breed that far north. So the Queensland birds were tracked breeding, I think, in northern China or thereabouts. So there is a huge difference between the breeding ground range of our Queensland and our Darwin birds.
Now, we got some good news with the curlew and the Chinese government, didn't we, in the not too distant past?
Yeah.
China is going to protect the habitat for migratory seabirds, so they've finally recognised how important it is. But we're not being as consistent here. Yeah,
well, that's the new policy, I think it is, or revised policy, is really just about regulating the reclamation that they do on the tidal flats, which is a great thing because I think, from my understanding, there was a lot of unregulated or illegal mudflat clearance, and just to have that regulation by the government will definitely protect the habitat. And you know, we want to see the same thing here in Australia, is the full protection of habitat that these shorebirds use. And there's some good criteria that you would use if you're protecting the shorebirds, which is whether you have a national, whether you've met a national threshold of the population or the international threshold. So here in Darwin, at our one site at Darwin Port, we are really close to meeting the 1% international threshold of importance. So that's really close to 1% of the entire world's population at one site at one particular time.
Okay, that sounds like a very arbitrary number though, doesn't it? Because if one population somewhere in the world crashes, all of a sudden your population will be much more than 1% because it's such a low baseline.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. You can definitely see some population crashes over time, and there's been some research work done on great knots great knot population declines as a result of the Samangan seawall that was put in many years ago. I think it was 2005 or 2006, and as a result of that, there was something like 90,000 great knots were lost from the entire flyway population. So we know that it can happen. We don't know what happens to these birds or where they go, if they do go anywhere, or whether it's an indirect mortality from these kinds of habitat losses.
Is the community involved in the Curlew project and Darwin Harbour? Like, have you got reclamation of maybe some mangrove habitat or fencing off and things like that with community groups being involved?
We don't so much have fencing off or anything like that. So our project on the Curlew is a partnership with the local Larrakia Indigenous Rangers. So we work with them on understanding the environment and also gaining that cultural aspect of the coastal environment. There's also some other community work done by Conservation Volunteers Australia on weed clearing of particular habitat for the Far Eastern Curlew. And then in terms of the actual volunteer community around Darwin, there's other local bird watchers that will go and monitor shorebirds generally. And then they put their data into bird data, and that goes into the Shorebirds 2020 conservation program.
That was my next question was what's involved in the monitoring? I mean, you do some netting and some banding, I imagine. Yep. Do you weigh the birds?
Yeah, so the catching process is catching them either with a mist net or potentially with a cannon net, and we'll do some cannon netting later in the year. And then if we are successful catching a bird, we will weigh it and we will band it. We'll put a yellow over blue flag on the bird's legs, and they're engraved with unique codes so we can identify them in the field. And then we also age the bird based on its molt. So we stretch out their wing feathers and count the primaries, which are their outer wing feathers, and then age it based on where they are, what stage of their molt they're at. We also measure the bill and the head bill length, and the length of the bill will tell us whether it's a male or a female, because the females have longer bills than males. So our two birds that we flagged and banded last year were both males.
What's the current population that you're monitoring at Darwin? Like how many birds, individual birds, were you able to identify last year through the project? So
we've done some population estimates based on an aerial survey that we completed in 2017, and we did a whole of harbour survey at low tide, and then we repeated it again at high tide, and we found the maximum count of Far Eastern Curlew across the harbour was 329 individuals, and that's across the whole harbour. Most of those birds were roosting in the East Arm Wharf Darwin Port site, and that's where we catch the birds, and we also catch the birds in one of the neighbouring salt pans. And we've only caught two because they are super hard to catch.
Is there a threat to the birds when they're roosting from pest species like feral cats or foxes, dogs?
Yeah, definitely. So the shorebirds are impacted by introduced species. We don't have foxes up here in the tropics, but we've definitely got a lot of feral cats. We've got dingoes, we've got feral dogs. But actually the main threat to roosting shorebirds around Darwin and around a lot of Australia is disturbances by humans and their dogs. So walking along the beach and disturbing flocks of birds.
Is there a way, do you think, to raise the awareness with the community who are using the fringes of the mudflats or crabbing and looking for sandworms and other fishing bait and whatnot, so that those sites don't get randomly disturbed by people who probably have no idea the birds are there?
Yeah, and that's a good point, because the birds are grey and brown and sandy coloured, and they blend in so well with the background. So a lot of people don't realise that they're there, but oftentimes you'll see the large flocks flying up as in response to disturbance. So it's only then that the people realise that there's birds there. We do a lot of advocacy work and kind of campaigning for the conservation of shorebirds in Darwin. There's a couple of different community groups, including the BirdLife Top End branch, and we are trying to protect the birds. We're trying to raise awareness, but it is a hard thing. In Darwin, we've got this transient population, so there's a high turnover of people, and you might get people on board and you might start to educate different people, but often they will end up leaving. So you're always reinvigorating that enthusiasm for shorebirds and the understanding and education around the conservation of these birds. So it's an ongoing matter, really.
Other community bodies like the relevant city council and planning authorities, and I don't know what it's like up there, but there's different bodies involved in the management of intertidal zones and whatnot with the state down here. Are they all on board with what what you guys are doing?
Yeah, they are. So they're really great. So we've got the Northern Territory Parks and Wildlife that manage the Casuarina Coastal Reserve, and that's where most of the shorebirds are in Darwin Harbour. We've got large populations of great knots and greater sandplovers and lots of other birds and the eastern curlew out at the reserve. They also have a lot of signage around the site, and they also help out with some of our community engagement events. And then we've also got the City of Darwin Council, and they do quite similar things. They've helped with the shorebird community events and also some signage. So they've created some really beautiful signage to educate people walking past the roost site. So they're really great. And then, the conservation volunteers, they're also doing events and these survey monitoring programs. And I think that's it so far.
That sounds really positive, like everybody's on board and it's coordinated. The question I always ask about any of these projects, and once upon a time I used to run similar projects when I was involved in land care, the funding's always got an end date. So how long is your project slated to continue?
Well, the Curlew project, that specifically finishes in mid-2020. So I hope to have results and the management recommendations available to Darwin Port and to any other project body that might be interested. What I've found since being in Darwin since 2011 was that there's been these rolling opportunities to manage shorebirds and to engage and protect the shorebirds. And that's been through the university that I work at and also the Parks and Wildlife and also the Darwin Port. So there's been a lot of uptake of this issue and how do we manage them and how do we continue protecting them. So what I'm hoping is that as we're learning more and more about shorebirds, we're also creating more awareness around what we need to do and how we can manage them. And the thing with managing a threatened species is that it is ongoing. So we will have to continue some sort of shorebird management program, whether it's funded through the port or through the university or some other body in some way. But there is a need for ongoing shorebird management in a tropical harbour here in Northern Australia where there is lots of development and there's lots of human population and we're pretty much living on top of these shorebird sites. So I always say that I can go 10 minutes from my house, walk 10 minutes and I can see thousands of these shorebirds, and I'm so lucky to have these birds on my doorstep, essentially on my doorstep.
I grew up on a coastal area with mud flats not far away and lots of sandbanks and whatnot. And in my childhood, I saw lots and lots of shorebirds. But if I go to the same place now, they're gone. They just aren't there. So.
Yes, well, that's the thing with the shorebird decline is that the hardest hit places in our flyway, the East Asian Australasian flyway, are the places in southern Australia. So that's what you regard as the migration terminus. And when there is a decline, that's where you start to see the most extreme changes.
I'm really hoping that as time goes on and the funding for your project winds up, that there's more funding and more coordination for GPS tracking particularly. It seems a really useful tool of birds that have found their way to all the different sites where the curlew arrives in Australia and the other critically endangered birds like the great knot and the godwits that come here.
Yep.
Do you think that might be an extension of what you're doing now?
I hope so. I think, as I said before, that there is a need for ongoing management of the birds, and I hope to stay in Darwin anyway because I do really like it. And before my some of my projects on the shorebirds, there wasn't much research on shorebirds. There wasn't really much of an analysis of how the shorebirds were doing in terms of their overall population in the harbour. And if you think about Northern Australia as a huge expanse of land, there's so much coastline that is unmonitored. So there's the Roebuck Bay area, which is monitored, and there's the Gulf of Carpentaria, which is sometimes monitored, and then there's far north Queensland, which is also monitored in Gladstone Harbour. But in between, Darwin in the Northern Territory is pretty much the only place that is being monitored. So it's a really important spot, and it's so vital that we continue monitoring and understanding the birds and tracking them. So the GPS stuff has been so useful just to understand that local movement. And one thing we found from the tracking is that the birds are heavily reliant on a few sites in particular, and they just move between those sites day after day. They're not making huge movements from within the harbour, so they're really, really heavily reliant on salt pans and the mudflat and some of these artificial sites like the dredge ponds at the Eastern Wharf Darwin Port site. So it's been really interesting finding that out.
Tell us about the artificial sites. I'm not aware of what they are and how they benefit the curlew.
Yeah, so the artificial site is a series of dredge ponds at Darwin Port's Eastern Wharf, and that's the site that I mentioned that I've been monitoring for the last 5 or 6 years, but we have about 9 years worth of data for that site. The site itself is only about 15 years old, so it is fairly new. The dredge ponds were made from reclaiming this tidal flat area and then building the actual wharf site. Because of the expansion of the Eastern Wharf, they had to put this dredge spoil material from Darwin Harbour somewhere, so they created these ponds. And actually, they created these ponds and then the birds started using them. So the birds weren't actually roosting at this site in the past because it would have been underwater. But because the site was created, it was really attractive to the birds because it's so close to where the birds feed. It's entirely protected because it's a fenced-off site. So the disturbances that I mentioned before don't really occur at this site because it's restricted access only. You need a pass to get in there, and an induction, and all the relevant PPE. High-vis vest and so on. So so if you're a bird, it's really attractive. It's a great site. It's close to where you feed, so you don't have to fly very far from your feeding ground to your roosting ground. So the daily commute is low, and it's got some shallow water in the ponds. So for birds in tropical Australia, one of the things that they really have to manage is their thermoregulation so that they don't overheat because it's just so hot here. So they often stand in shallow water, and that helps to thermoregulate through the legs.
The birds from Darwin undertake a migration of between 9,000 and 12,000 kilometres, depending on how far north they go to breed.
Yeah.
Have you got the data on what they weigh when they arrive here from the breeding grounds and roughly what they weigh when they leave?
We don't, because we caught our birds in November and then in December. So we only caught one bird in November, one in December. If we wanted that data, then we would have to catch a bird in, say, August, because we start getting curlews arriving in August onwards. They start to leave from about February, March, all the way until April. So they have that really wide period of when they're here. And they're just so tricky to catch. I don't think we would be able to do that. But we know their weight when they were caught. And they, like all the other shorebirds, they have to put on an immense amount of weight before they migrate.
Yeah, I was just looking for an easy percentage, makes it easy to relate to how much energy they expend to do the journey either way.
Yeah, a huge amount of energy to do that migration flight. Maybe that's something I could look at just as a modelling exercise later on, because we do have the flight speeds that they were going at between Darwin and the Yellow Sea and all the way to Siberia.
Because we've been talking about protecting the habitat and how crucial it is, and most of the time we think about land use, but the invertebrate food supply is critical. If the habitat is altered in a way that affects the invertebrates, well, even if the flats are still there and the land use hasn't effectively changed from a human visual point of view, the birds have still got no reason to be here.
Yeah, they've still got to find food to eat. And so that's one of the things that I'm hoping to learn more about, is specifically what the Eastern Curlew is feeding on in Darwin Harbour and how much of that is available to them. So we know from other studies that the Far Eastern Curlew prefers crustaceans as their prey. And so we have an idea that that's what they eat in Darwin Harbour, but obviously there's different invertebrate species communities in Darwin to other places in Australia. So we want to know how that compares to those other sites, and also, if they are getting enough energy from the food that's available in Darwin Harbour.
Now, a question has just occurred to me that I hadn't prepared. The females have longer bills than the male, both absolutely and relatively. Is that because... Or do you think, it's probably impossible to prove, but do you think that that's because the egg production requires them to actually become heavier before they head off, and the longer bill helps the females get tastier, juicier morsels or more morsels?
Yeah, I think that's the general theory behind it, is that because females do have to carry that reproductive cost to them, they have to access more food. So they have to be able to access food that the males can't access. So it's essentially a competitive advantage over the males.
I know nothing about curlew breeding behaviour. Do they do like the swans and the albatross? Are they mated for life, or is it a haphazard free-for-all at breeding season?
Yeah, I actually don't know a lot about their breeding habitats. I believe that they would do some sort of beautiful elaborate flight display to attract individuals for mating, because we know that other shorebird species do that. And I imagine that they would probably breed with the same partner for that breeding season. I'm not sure if they can find that same partner the following year, particularly with population declines being what they are. So, I'd have to take a guess on that one or just read about it later.
That begs the question, sort of, how closely is the research being done here in the southern end of the range being shared or being used by the people managing the habitat in the northern part of the range, in the breeding part of the range?
Yeah, we don't have a lot of links between those two areas, and the management would be slightly different between those areas just because it's such different habitat. The birds use the environment, interact with the environment in a really different way in the southern hemisphere than they do in the northern hemisphere. So you've also got different threats and different land uses. So they are quite different, but we hope that we will be able to share and extend the research with all parts of the flyway, so that if you are managing the species from wherever you are, that you're aware of what's happening in other parts of the flyway for that species, so that you can work collectively on protecting the bird.
If somebody wanted to help out with the work you're doing, and I'm assuming that GPS transmitters that were being donated would be gratefully accepted, how would they go about doing that?
Well, if people are interested in being involved with the Curlew project, they can get in touch with me directly just by emailing me, or if they're in Darwin, then I'm happy to catch up at some point. We've got a couple of people that volunteer on a regular basis with catching the birds, and also being involved with counting the birds, so the shorebird monitoring program that we have. And as I mentioned before, the Lilleyman Rangers, they're involved too in measuring the environmental aspects of it. So there's a couple of different options, but yeah, I'm happy to chat about things. We've got a cannon netting expedition coming up in November, and people are more than welcome to join that if they're happy to.
Well, I'll put your contact information, a link over to your page, and a couple of the really interesting articles I found about the Curlew project on the on the post for here. Amanda, what do you think the outlook is realistically for the curlew, for the Far Eastern Curlew?
The idea with managing threatened species and shorebird conservation is that you want to halt the declines and then possibly even bring the population numbers back up to a more stable population rather than a declining trajectory.
Amanda, what do you think the outlook is for the population of the curlew that you're looking at in the Darwin Harbour?
Well, I hope that in Darwin Harbour at a really local scale that we can continue protecting the habitat for the Eastern Curlew, but then also possibly continue increasing the population, so enhance the population that we already have here. We might even continue protecting the natural sites and the artificial sites, but there's a possibility of potentially creating habitat for the birds. So we know that they use artificial habitat at the moment, and if need be, we might even have to create some into the future. At a larger kind of national scale, it's really hard to say, but one of the things in threatened species conservation science is to halt declines, so halt population declines, and then also to increase population sizes so that the trends stabilize over time rather than a declining forecast.
Have you got an estimate you use for the worldwide population as it stands?
Yeah, so we use the revised population estimates for the shorebirds of the East Asian Australasian flyway. So that was done by Birgitta Hansen and fellow researchers, I think back in 2016. So they're a whole of flyway population estimates, and that's what we work on at the moment, and that's where we get our figures for the national and international thresholds from.
Where are they based?
The researchers, well, they're actually researchers from all around Australia, and Birgitta is based in Victoria at Ballarat University, I think it is.
Oh, okay. So are there population studies being done in the like the transit areas like Korea and China, and also being done at the far northern breeding grounds?
Yeah, so there's a lot of people in the shorebird community that go out and count shorebirds, and there's different programs in parts of the flyway, particularly in the Yellow Sea region, when the birds are in transit, and that's been really helpful to know how many birds actually make it through these bottleneck systems and how many we get here in Australia. So just relating those figures to one another. I imagine that there is some monitoring on the breeding grounds, but I'm not sure of how large the programs are, because the area that these birds breed at is huge. So it would be a huge logistical challenge to get out and monitor those birds when they are breeding. So actually, the best population estimates are from the non-breeding grounds, because we know that at particular times of the year, more or less, the entire population will be in the southern hemisphere. So you can get better coverage by counting birds on the non-breeding grounds.
Outside of Australia, what are the other strongholds for the southernmost parts of the range? What other countries have significant populations of non-breeding curlew?
It would be places in the Asia-Pacific region, so places in Indonesia, and I'm just not sure specifically of where the birds occur, but they definitely have that larger distribution. So yeah, they're not just found in Australia. Some are even found in New Zealand, but at much lower numbers.
Do you think it's possible that in, say, Indonesia and maybe remoter parts of Malaysia and even Thailand, that there may be sort of hidden or undiscovered populations?
Yeah, possibly. It would really depend on the monitoring coverage at those sites and how many shorebird researchers are getting out there counting birds, and if they're going to all the sites where there's potential habitat. One thing that I'd like to do in the Curlew project based in Darwin is to really figure out what makes up really good quality habitat for the Far Eastern Curlew, and then use that information at a kind of remote sensing, in a remote sensing kind of fashion, to look at habitat across northern Australia and then really pinpoint what potential habitat is available for Eastern Curlew, and then maybe one day go out and survey those sites. So for instance, we know that they like soft mud so that their bill can penetrate the mud so that they can feed. We know that the birds need roost sites close to feeding sites. So say, for instance, parts of northern Australia might have a lot of good low tide mudflat, but if they don't have a roost site nearby, that habitat may not be used that much by the shorebirds. So it's one thing would be to figure out exactly what's required by the birds and then going and essentially ground truthing it and figuring out if the birds do occur there, and then you can get these larger estimates of the bird populations.
Yeah, I think that's something that I hadn't considered as being so important for the birds, that there's a suitable roost site right near a feeding site. I just assumed that wherever they're feeding, they will be able to roost somewhere close by. So it's quite a complex demand that they have for the habitat that they select.
Yeah, exactly. So if they are feeding at a site, then they would have a roost site nearby. It's just about how much they're willing to commute each day. So particularly in Northern Australia, where we have these huge tides and this huge area that these birds can feed across, they will have to fly and do this daily commute 2 times a day between their low tide and high tide sites. And that really starts to add up for a bird that's critically trying to manage its energy balance so that they get it right, so that they can complete this migration. And that daily commute over so many months of the year, that's pretty important for a bird to consider. And one thing that I found in our GPS tracking is that the birds are using a really small area, so they are having a really short daily commute of something like less than 4 kilometres as a one-way trip, because that's the distance between the roost site and the low tide feeding site. So they also are highly competitive, so they will kind of keep a territory of where they're feeding and stay close to it. So they do need that roost site nearby as well.
You mentioned they're very competitive. Does that mean they're the bullies of the shorebird world?
No, not bullies. It's just the natural system of a lot of animal species is that they will need to be competitive to maintain their patch, essentially. Not all shorebirds do it. So some shorebirds will feed with other birds in the system, and they would be considered communal flocking birds, communally flocking or cooperative foraging birds. And those birds are things like knots. So the great knots and the red knots will often feed in groups together. But things like Eastern Curlew and Wimbrel and even greenshank and some of the plovers, they'll often maintain their territories and feed as single birds in their ecosystem, and sometimes they'll even compete with one another with the different species. So not even within the curlew species, but sometimes with other species that they may find a threat to what they're feeding on.
Whoever can reach the deep worms or sand crabs or cockles or whatever it is that they're getting hold of. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, Amanda, you mentioned early on that your interest was always in shorebird, beg your pardon. When this project wraps up, where do you see yourself heading?
I hope to stay in Darwin working on shorebirds still. So I'm not sure, but, I'll kind of just wait or maybe even create some sort of shorebird opportunity if I can. I obviously really like working with shorebirds, but I also really like the community engagement aspect of it, and also the community, the science communication aspect of it. So, there's a couple of different avenues I could possibly go down, but I do really like working within the university system and researching shorebirds. So hope to just continue managing shorebirds in a conservation science setting.
Maybe an obvious question, but do you have a favourite shorebird?
Yeah, I do have a favourite shorebird, and it's actually not the Eastern Curlew. It's the bar-tailed godwit.
The critically endangered bar-tailed godwit?
Yeah, that's right.
Didn't you catch one of them recently?
Yeah, so we caught some bar-tailed godwits last year, and the year before, and the year before that.
Oh.
And so we're just so lucky. We've been lucky to catch a couple of godwits in Darwin with our mist nets and with our cannon nets. We actually don't have that many godwits in Darwin Harbour itself, but they are around, and we have caught some. And I was lucky enough to catch one in 2014, and actually it wasn't so lucky, but the bird did have some leg cramping, and which meant it couldn't walk immediately, but I rehabilitated the bird, and over that week-long course of rehabilitating it, I became quite close to it and really felt a strong connection with the bar-tailed godwit, and it's actually been my favourite bird ever since. And that bird did survive, and it did continue to migrate over the years.
What did the rehabilitation entail?
It essentially was just keeping the bird in a sling. So the sling supported the bird's body weight, and it meant that the bird didn't have to carry itself on its legs. So I was trying to help the bird release its cramping from its legs, so that that buildup of lactic acid that happens when the leg muscles cramp. And then I fed the bird every day. I fed it 3 times a day. And I also really gently massaged the bird's leg and toes. And then by the 6th day, it was standing up in its box, so it didn't need the sling. And then on the 7th day, it wouldn't take any food when I was trying to feed it, so I released it. And it flew off.
Well, that's a great success story.
Yeah, I was really happy with it.
I'd love to know how you do therapeutic massage on a godwit.
I know. Yeah, well, that's why I became so attached to this bird, and it's a really beautiful bird. And that bird had the leg flags AB, so I named it Abby.
Abby. And did Abby have a personality that was distinct from other godwits that you've had relationships with?
Well, the Abby godwit, she actually, once she realised she could stand again, she was pretty feisty and she didn't want the food. So she just became the independent female godwit and wanted to be released. So she's taking care of herself now. She's been resighted in Japan several times and then back in Darwin the following migration season. So yeah, she's good. She's managed to migrate, and yeah, it's really wonderful to see her back in Darwin.
What's your estimate of how old Abby is now?
Well, she was definitely over 2 or 3 years old in 2014. So yeah, she would be 5+, 7+ years as a minimum. But who really knows? It's always hard to tell the age of shorebirds. You can only really be definite with the age of shorebirds if you catch them in their first year of life and then you continue catching them or resighting them. But beyond that, it's a pretty coarse estimate of whether they're 2+ or 3+, but you don't actually know if they're 2 years old or just more than 2 years old.
Jumping back to the curlew, and you can answer for godwits as well, and sandpipers or any other that you know the answer. How long does a curlew live?
The shorebirds are long-lived, so they do live up to 15 years or older. Some shorebirds that have been banded and then resighted or re-trapped through these catching studies, some of them are actually over 20 years old. So some of the knots are 21 years old, and it's spectacular that they can live so old. It's amazing.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought that 20 years was the span, but that just goes to show that one bad breeding year can have a really significant impact on the population for any of these kinds of birds.
Yeah, that's right. And if you imagine a bird flying this migration flight between hemispheres every year, it's estimated that over the course of an individual shorebird's life, it flies a distance from the Earth to the Moon. It's
staggering when you think about it. So if you're one of those people who whinges about flying from Australia to somewhere in Southeast Asia for a holiday, just think of the curlew, think of the godwit, think of the ruff and the knot, and just pull your head in.
Fair thought for shorebirds.
Exactly. And they've got to run around eating all day, fending off the neighbours. It's a tough life.
Exactly, and flying away from all those humans and those dogs and moving around the environment as coastal development takes over the landscape.
Amanda, we like to get to know our researchers and birdo nuts a little bit well when we do an interview. How long have you been interested in birds generally?
So generally, it was actually only about 10 years ago that I started becoming interested in birds, and that was I was interested in the other animal groups as well. and I got a bird field guide.
Which one?
And I started looking at birds, and then I realized that they were so easy to see and they were everywhere that I decided I wanted to continue working with birds. And then when I found out about shorebirds, it was this whole new world where they were this group of birds of browns and greys and pretty boring and hard to identify, and a small part of the birding community were interested in them and not everyone. And, you know, they were just interesting to me. So I thought, yeah, I want to work on these shorebirds and then continue working on them. And yeah, have been with shorebirds ever since in a research capacity. But yeah, I like all birds in general. You know, go out bird watching and photograph birds. It's a lot of fun.
So as an eager young birder, which field guide was your first one?
My first one was the Simpson and Day field guide to the birds of Australia, but I've now moved on to the Australian Bird Guide, which is the new CSIRO guide.
Oh, I'm really hoping to talk to the Australian Bird Guide crew quite soon. That I was having a little look at that book today, actually. It's a beauty, and it's not in my shelves yet.
It's a brilliant bird guide, really useful. Beautiful illustrations.
Yeah, and an unusual field guide in the sense that it's quite large.
It is large. It's essentially like a encyclopedia of the birds. So really useful, and I think it's great because it's got so much information in it, and it's only like $50. So I thought it was a bargain.
So you got a finder's fee from the publisher.
No, I just think it's so great because I've had a few issues with some illustrations of the other bird field guides, and it's really nice to see one field guide where they've just got all the illustrations correct. Like you cannot spot an error essentially in the illustrations. I just think they're marvellous.
That's a ringing endorsement. That's a great recommendation. Pretty much the final question for you, Amanda. What's your favourite piece of birding equipment or tech or gadget?
Well, you know, the binoculars are the most useful piece of equipment that a birdwatcher can have. But if you're into shorebirds, you absolutely have to have a spotting scope. So you really want that high magnification. So I often think that the spotting scope is the most useful piece of equipment for the shorebird studies. But I've also really been enjoying long lens photography. So that's been really great at capturing some nice photos of birds. And I've even been able to capture photos of birds with their leg flags, and also the curlew with the GPS tag. I was photographing curlews in flight. It was last year or even earlier this year. And when I got home and looked at the photos and zoomed in on them, I noticed one of the birds had a GPS tag on its back, and I realised it was one of my tagged birds.
Which one?
So taking photos of birds is really useful.
Was it oo or oi?
I actually don't know which one it was because I could only see its GPS tag, not the leg flags.
Didn't you go and check the website to see which one was hanging out where you were that day?
I did. I looked back at the website and I had both of them there.
Oh, trust them to
so
be so.
So I couldn't be either one.
Oh, they are difficult characters. Amanda, it's been an absolute pleasure spending this time with you, and I hope people have learned a lot about the Curlew Project, the curlews in general, and specifically about you.
Thank you so much.
I would hope that when you move on to your next part of the shorebird adventure, that we'll be able to speak again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the chat.
So there we have it. Amanda Lilleyman doing great work with the curlews in Darwin. If you've enjoyed the show, let me know what you like about it or what you don't like about it. Just rating or review would be lovely. You can do that in Apple Podcasts or anywhere else that you are listening to your podcasts. And I'd look forward to taking on your suggestions. Thanks again. Look forward to the next episode with Harry Sadler.